Picture this: a cold stone cathedral lit by flickering candles, the air heavy with incense and silence. At the center, a little girl, barely tall enough to reach the altar, is dressed in silk robes that drag across the floor. She clutches a bouquet of herbs with trembling fingers. She is 6 years old. Across from her stands a man 23 years her senior, a fully grown king in armor and jewels, towering over her like a mountain over a sapling. The gathered nobles avert their eyes. Some whisper prayers under their breath. Others stare with unreadable faces. No one dares object, because this is not a wedding born of love. It is a contract sealed in politics and power. And the child at the altar is nothing more than a pawn in a game too large for her to understand. The priest speaks the holy words, words meant to unite two souls in sacred union. Yet the girl cannot even read, let alone comprehend the vows being forced into her mouth. The king presses a ring onto her tiny finger, and the court erupts in applause. To them, this is victory. To her, it is the end of childhood before it ever began. This was not an anomaly. In medieval Europe, child brides were tools of diplomacy. Their lives gambled away for alliances, treaties, and thrones. But this particular union, between a 6-year-old child and a 29-year-old king, would echo through history, exposing the brutal reality of medieval marriage and power. To understand how a 6-year-old could be forced into the arms of a grown man, we need to look at both sides of this marriage, the child bride and the king who claimed her. The girl at the altar was not just any child, she was a princess. Her bloodline tied her to powerful dynasties, and her tiny body carried the weight of entire kingdoms' ambitions. In medieval Europe, daughters of royalty weren't raised with bedtime stories or toys. They were raised as bargaining chips. From the moment she could walk, her future had been mapped out in treaties, promises, and whispered negotiations in candlelit chambers. On the other side stood the king. 29 years old, hardened by years of politics and war, he was not seeking companionship. He was seeking leverage. For him, the marriage was a weapon. By binding himself to this child, he secured lands, titles, and a fragile peace with rival powers. He didn't need a bride. He needed an heir, an alliance, and most importantly, legitimacy. Behind the scenes, advisors and priests crafted justifications. The church, whose approval was essential, argued that the marriage was acceptable because it would not be consummated until the girl reached suitable age. But everyone knew what that meant. She was a placeholder until she matured into the body of a woman. In the meantime, she would be paraded at court as a queen in name, her crown heavier than her head could bear. But while the king may have seen only strategy, the young girl endured the consequences. Stripped of her toys, her nursemaids, and her familiar halls, she was thrust into a court that demanded she behave like an adult. Chroniclers noted her silence during ceremonies, her stiff posture at banquets, her tiny hands clutching goblets she could barely lift. Behind her jeweled crown was a child who still had baby teeth, forced to smile beside a man she likely feared. The nobles and foreign ambassadors who witnessed this union had mixed reactions. Some celebrated the brilliance of the political maneuver, others whispered unease. Even in a world accustomed to early marriages, 6 years old was shockingly young. Rumours spread across Europe. Was this desperation? Was the king truly so hungry for power that he'd bind himself to a child? And yet, within the framework of medieval politics, the move worked. The alliance was sealed. Rival factions hesitated. The king's position was strengthened. But every gain for him was a loss for her. Because in this marriage, there was no choice, no consent, no voice. She was 6 years old. He was 29. And though the ink on the treaty was barely dry, the girl's life had already been signed away. The wedding was only the beginning. For the 6-year-old child now called Queen, life at court was nothing short of a prison gilded in gold. Though the marriage had been declared sacred by the church, everyone knew the truth. She was far too young for its duties. Still, appearances mattered. She was dressed in royal finery, paraded before ambassadors, and expected to sit silently beside her husband as though she were a partner in governance. In reality, she was a child who should have been playing in palace gardens, not attending councils of war. The king treated the marriage as a triumph of strategy. With her at his side, he gained legitimacy in the eyes of rival dynasties. Every banquet they attended together, every portrait commissioned, was less about celebrating love than about showcasing his power. She was a symbol, a living treaty. The court marveled at her jeweled gowns, whispering about her beauty, but those whispers ignored the tragedy. Behind the silken pearls was a little girl who could barely read or write, suddenly forced into a role that carried the weight of nations. But not everyone accepted this union quietly. Among his enemies, the marriage was ridiculed. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters mocking the king for wedding a child, while others used it as propaganda, claiming it revealed desperation, not strength. To them, it was proof that his kingdom was vulnerable, reliant on a child bride to cement shaky alliances. Inside the palace walls, the girl endured her own silent battles. Accounts suggest she struggled with loneliness, separated from her family, and placed under the strict watch of tutors, governesses, and guards. Instead of dolls, she was given books of etiquette. Instead of lullabies, she heard heated arguments about politics echoing through council chambers. Imagine a 6-year-old, barely past the age of nursery rhymes, now reprimanded if she didn't bow at the right moment or keep her gaze lowered at feasts. The psychological toll was immense. Chroniclers noted her withdrawn nature, her habit of retreating into silence when addressed by lords and ladies. She was expected to embody dignity and composure, yet she remained a child trapped in rituals she could not understand. Every slip, every stumble during a procession, every tear shed in public was seen as a failure, not of her, but of the alliance she represented. Meanwhile, the king continued to wage wars and negotiate treaties, often leaving her alone in cold stone chambers while he played the role of monarch on the battlefield. She became a ghost at court, always present but rarely acknowledged, her existence serving the crown more than her own life ever would. The marriage had achieved its political aim, but for the little girl, the cost was her childhood. She had been crowned a queen, yet stripped of everything that made her human. And as the years passed, whispers began. What would become of her when she grew older? Would she find freedom, or be bound even tighter to the throne that had stolen her youth? The marriage had secured the king's ambitions, but history rarely preserves the stories of the powerless, especially when that powerless figure was a child bride. And yet, in the shadows of chronicles and court records, fragments of her fate remain. When the king fell from power, whether by rebellion, illness, or betrayal, his downfall cast a long shadow over his young bride. She was still barely more than a child, yet her identity had been bound to his reign. Suddenly, the crown that had weighed so heavily on her head became a liability. Rival factions debated her future as though she were a piece of land to be divided. Would she be sent back to her family? Retained as a widow to preserve alliances? Or most chilling of all, remarried to yet another powerful man, her fate once again decided by politics? What is clear is that she never escaped the label placed on her the moment the ring was forced onto her finger. In some accounts, she lived out her days in quiet obscurity, tucked away in a convent, an all too common fate for child brides whose usefulness had expired. Others suggest she was maneuvered into another marriage when she was still a teenager, her body finally old enough to serve the purposes her first marriage had anticipated. But regardless of the specifics, her story reveals something darker about medieval society. Child brides like her were never meant to have lives of their own. They were vessels for dynasties, pawns on a board controlled by kings, priests, and nobles. Their suffering was cloaked in ritual, sanctified by the church and legitimized by politics. And history, written by men who benefited from these arrangements, often glossed over the horror. To us today, the idea of a 6-year-old bride is almost unthinkable. Yet in her world, it was considered not only acceptable, but necessary. Her stolen childhood reminds us that the medieval court was not just a stage for grand feasts and heroic battles. It was also a place where innocence was sacrificed for power. And while her name may have faded from memory, the reality she endured still echoes. She represents countless forgotten children across history who were forced into marriages before they even understood the meaning of the word. The story of the 6-year-old child bride married to a 29-year-old king is not a fairy tale of crowns and castles. It is a tragedy of power crushing innocence, of politics devouring humanity. And it forces us to confront the darkest truth about medieval monarchies, that for all their pageantry and glory, they were built on the suffering of the most vulnerable. She was not a queen in the way legends might portray her. She was a child, compelled, silenced, and erased. And in that silence lies the real horror of her story.